Okay, hi. Oh, there we go. Oh, excellent, it works, brilliant. Okay, so yes, hi everyone. My name is Keith Stuart. I am I have been a games journalist for about 20 years. Before that, I was a game developer for a couple of years. I've been thinking about games critically and creatively for about 23 years, but I've been playing them for 35 years. I started writing for video game magazines. In the mid-90s, I wrote for Edge. I was the writer on Edge. I helped launch the Dreamcast magazine, DC UK, and I've written about games for lots of people. But now I'm the video games editor at The Guardian, so I commission and write all of The Guardian's games coverage on our website, which hopefully you've read. So I'm a video game journalist, which is a very serious job, as you can see. But last year, I did something very different. I wrote a book. I wrote a novel called A Boy Made of Blocks, and it's a novel of a father called. It's about a father called Alex and his son, who's 8 years old, called Sam, and he's on the autism spectrum. And the novel is about how Alex learns to communicate and share his life with his son through the video game Minecraft. And the novel is semi-autobiographical because my own son is on the autism spectrum, and we did indeed learn a lot about each other through Minecraft. Minecraft was the first thing that he really became enthusiastic about and expressed himself through. And to see that happening was wonderful to me and profoundly changed my life and my understanding of games and game worlds. So I wrote a novel about it, and the novel's done reasonably well. It's available now in 26 countries, and it's sold, actually it's 175,000 copies so far in the UK. And the great thing about it is it seems to have struck people. People have told me, have emailed me and written reviews online to say it's kind of told them about autism. It's told them a lot about it, which is incredible to hear. Parents of children who say they've read my book and it's helped them to understand things about their kid, and that's amazing to understand. But when I set out to write the novel, I had a kind of a problem. And my problem was, how do I get people to care about Minecraft who don't play video games? The people that buy novels don't tend to be gamers. It's a very different demographic. And in my book, there's lots of occasions where Sam and Alex go into Minecraft and play Minecraft together. And there's lots of descriptions of Minecraft. So I had to make the world of Minecraft, a video game world, relatable and meaningful to people that don't play video games. And it was a real kind of task for me, a real problem, something I really worried about. And during this time, when I was writing the book, I started to interview video game studios about the way that they make worlds, about the way they make worlds that people will care about, that their players will care about. Partly this was just interesting to me as a journalist, but partly I wanted to steal all their ideas for myself. So really this is a kind of a talk about creative inspiration and about creating interesting, imaginative places that people want to share with you as creators. The first thing I learned from great game developers was the importance of establishing a specific, consistent tone in your world. Tone is a really ambiguous and complicated concept, but it really means like the emotional or psychological feel of your world. And it's kind of established, we see it in cinema established through lighting, through the use of shadow, through the use of sound. But it's the way that your world feels. And it's got to be kind of consistent. It's got to look like something. In Boy Made of Blocks, when I was describing the Minecraft landscape, I tried to use loads of like soft, pleasant adjectives. I wrote a lot about the sun and the light because I wanted to suggest to readers that it was a safe and comfortable place. I also mentioned the music of Minecraft a lot when I was writing about Minecraft in my book, because Daniel Rosenfeld's soundtrack for Minecraft is so beautiful and peaceful, and it creates a kind of permissive mood. It makes you feel relaxed. And I brought that into my novel to try and make people feel the same way. So tone is really, really important. There are lots of developers who are amazing at using landscapes to create strong, specific tones. That game company with Journey and with Flow, Play Dead with their game Limbo and their game Inside, and Monument Valley by Us Two are games that really establish a strong visual audio tone. They make you feel a certain way when you just look at the landscape. But one of my favorites, one of the best studios I think for creating tone is Bethesda. the creators of Elder Scrolls and Fallout. In Fallout 4 specifically, the development team creates a really kind of incredibly consistent and intriguing tone to their world. They use lighting and shadow and panoramic scenery in a really interesting, fascinating way. When you look around the world of Fallout, it communicates the emotion to you of a wasted and ruined world. When I asked the director, Todd Howard, about his visual influences, he immediately brought up John Ford, the famous American director of Western movies like Stagecoach and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And he told me something about the way he watched John Ford, and I think it's really interesting, and I've kind of written down his quote, what Todd Howard told me. And he says, we look at old John Ford movies a lot. We study how cinema can capture a space. His shots put you in a certain mood. There is a tone. As a designer, you must look for tone. How do you want the player to feel? Look for things outside of games that have a tone and just stare at them. And I found this really interesting. They all sit around in the studio and watch these movies, and they're not really watching them to learn about the stories or the characters. They're watching them to understand the mood. So if you look, for example, there's a screenshot from Fallout 4 and a screenshot from The Searchers. There's lots of differences between them, but you can tell the tone is really similar in that you look at The Searchers and you understand the world that these men are living in. It communicates something to it. And the same with Fallout. This kind of use of this weird, degraded color, this use of shadow and light really expresses to you what Fallout 4 is about. And it's so consistent throughout the entire world. It's so clever. Television is also an interesting place to learn about tone. Watching television is really important because tone is communicated really beautifully by television photographers. Guerrilla Software, the creators of Horizon Zero Dawn, had a really interesting influence when they were creating that kind of beautiful golden look of their game. Horizon Zero Dawn is a game which kind of communicates this idea of rebirth and the dawn of civilization through kind of really beautiful, natural, but hyper-realistic colors. And they took this from BBC wildlife documentaries. They were really inspired by the tone of the documentaries that David Attenborough and his team make. And here's a great quote from Jan Bart van Beek, the art director of Horizon Zero Dawn. And he says, in Horizon, we wanted to give players a sense of being in a 24/7 version of BBC's nature programs, where lighting is always at its most epic and most impressive. Anything less than the best look, we would simply remove. So to some degree, we indeed make it unnatural. So when you play Horizon Zero Dawn, you'll notice that all the skyscapes are either at dusk or dawn, because those are the most dramatic times of the day. So it cycles through a day-night cycle, but you only ever see the most dramatic moments in that cycle. And it creates this feeling of rebirth, of rediscovery, of a natural world. It's incredible. And there are other really intriguing examples that I researched while I was writing Boy Made of Blocks, of the ways in which great game developers use and study and observe tone. Monument Valley is a great example. It's a really visually simple game, but they've taken the ideas and the use of color and shape and form from really interesting places. Monument Valley was heavily inspired by the film The Fall, directed by Tarsum Singh. I don't think it's a great film, but visually it's fascinating. And it proves that great ideas don't have to come from really obvious places. I think one of the problems with the video game industry is lots of its ideas tend to come from the same sources. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Aliens. Whereas there's this incredible, rich history of cinema that you can go to look for tone. I also think that games share a really rich visual language with the theatre. The great lighting designer Adolf Appia used lighting, shadow, and three-dimensional sets to create a sense of depth and unity between the actor and the environment. And video games use light in a very similar, instructive way to the way Appia used light. You use it for navigation and for narrative. I really looked at Appia's sets when I was writing Boy Made of Blocks, so I wanted to try and communicate the world of Minecraft. I studied the way that Appia used lighting to create mood. And I think, I don't know if Shadow of the Colossus, I doubt very much whether Shadow of the Colossus, the great game by Team Ico, was inspired by Adolf Appia, but you can see the way that they use light and tone and objects in a very, very similar way. It's very effective and grand and beautiful. So yeah, look to theatre for inspiration. It's massively overlooked, I think, by video game designers, but there are so many similarities in the way that theatre and video games work and the way they communicate. Your video game world has to reflect and communicate the emotions of the stories that they contain. Video game worlds are emotional spaces. When you think about the great writers and directors of the world, we're often told that, wow, they made that place feel like a person. So if you think about Charles Dickens, for example, the way that Charles Dickens writes about London in Great Expectations and Oliver Twist, he brings a real sense of character to the place. There's this kind of grime and darkness and fog about the world that makes it feel malevolent. Think about the way that Ridley Scott portrays Los Angeles in Blade Runner. That world, that universe that he makes kind of breathes emotion. It tells you about the space that Harrison Ford is living in. The world is the story in Blade Runner. It's the same thing as well with Wuthering Heights, the great Bronte novel. Again, when you read about the Moors in that book, it's as though the Moors are alive. They're a character in the novel, manipulating the other people. When I was writing Boy Made of Blocks, I realized that to make people care about Minecraft, I had to stop thinking about it almost as a video game environment. And I started to look at the way that other authors had created imaginary magical spaces. So I read C.S. Lewis's books and looked at Narnia. I read Winnie the Pooh and looked at how A.A. Milne wrote about the 100-Acre Wood. I looked at Wizard of Oz and tried to understand how the world of Oz is depicted. Because I wanted to make people understand Minecraft as a magical place, not a video game, but a place that things can happen, where things are possible. And what I learned from these worlds was that in all these places, what's really important about all these magical worlds, these kind of fictional landscapes, is that the magic is about love and friendship. Narnia, the 100-Acre Wood, and Oz are all about self-discovery and redemption and friendship. And that's the real magic of them. And I think that's the magic of video game worlds. You've got to think about the emotions of your story and of your characters and think about how the world can reflect them. In romantic art and literature, the natural world is highly symbolic and fraught with emotion and feeling. There's a great term, pathetic fallacy, which means, it refers to kind of a poetic convention of investing the landscape with human emotions. So pathetic fallacy was used a lot by the romantic poets, Byron, Keats, Shelley, Wordsworth, to make people to make the worlds that they conjured feel emotional. So obviously there's the great first line of William Wordsworth's poem, I wandered lonely as a cloud. Obviously clouds aren't lonely, but he created this image of a landscape which reflected his emotions. And I think that's what we've always got to do when we create imaginary worlds, make sure that they reflect the emotions of the action that's going on screen. A really great example of this, I think, was Gears of War. Epic Games described its visual style as destroyed beauty, and its worlds are packed with luscious ruins that reflect the kind of galactic catastrophe of the plot. But it also recalls the obsession with ancient ruins that kind of characterized art in the Enlightenment and the Romantic periods. And I think all game developers, all narrative game developers are romantics. I think you have to think about the world in that way. And I think for this reason, it's really valuable to go to art galleries and museums as much as you possibly can and soak in the atmosphere of them. Again, I'm not sure if Gears of War was kind of directly influenced by romantic art, but you can see the similarities between Gears of War and the Enlightenment romantic artists and the way they use ruined landscapes to sort of suggest something about society. Another great example while I'm here, which is again is kind of like a great kind of example of pathetic fallacy, was that Robin Haneke, the producer of Journey, talks about how that game company were heavily inspired by Dreams by Akira Kurosawa, the great weird symbolic movie. There's one section of Dreams where it's about a group of explorers who are lost in an icy wilderness, and very gradually they are tempted by a goddess, the personification of the wind and cold, who tries to get them to fall asleep. And Robin Hunicke was really, the producer of Journey, was really influenced by this sort of feel of the world encroaching on the lives of the characters. And she basically got the developers of Journey to think about Dreams by Akira Kurosawa and that sense of the world trying to kind of destroy and seduce the characters. And I think the ending of Journey is so beautiful, and it's so worth playing again. If you watch Dreams, watch this section of Dreams, then play Journey again, and you get that kind of connection. I missed that one. So finally, I think it's really, really important for the world to have meaning. Your video game world has to mean something. It has to have something to say. What I learned when I was talking to game developers was that the world kind of carries within itself a message, the message of what your game is about. In Boy Made of Blocks, I really carefully try to match the narrative events with certain types of landscape. And I kind of do it in a really obvious way, but you sort of have to be quite obvious when you're writing popular fiction. But the father in my book, Alex, found out about his son, Sam, and the more they communicated, the more they were able to explore, the deeper they were able to explore in the Minecraft world. So as they found out more about each other, they actually explored deeper and deeper caverns. So it's kind of like a very obvious visual metaphor, but I feel like it worked. I feel like I married the kind of emotional depth of their relationship with the geographic depth of their adventure. And I think that's really important. I think landscape, geography is a part of storytelling in a very kind of subtle way. And that scenery and location and environment are a story too. In video games, environmental storytelling is kind of a fascinating, evolving art form, and we see lots of games which use sort of things like environmental artifacts, like emails or post-it notes in their world to communicate a story with you. But you don't have to be that obvious. I think you can be much more subtle about what your story, what your world tells your audience, your gamers. So when I was writing Boy Made of Blocks, I visited a lot of landscape gardens from the 18th and 19th centuries. And if you study the theories and techniques of the great landscape gardens throughout Europe, especially like the theories of Capability Brown, who was one of the great landscape designers of that 18th century, you see how they created dramatic, emotional moments through their work. So if you go to a landscape garden, this is Stourhead in Somerset, which is really near where I live. And I love walking around. It's this beautiful walk around a lake. And it's designed so that lots of things are occluded from you by trees. So you turn around a corner and there might be a ruined building, or there might be some beautiful shrubbery, but everything's designed so that you're kind of surprised and you realize things as you go. And when I was walking around Stourhead, I realized that it's really similar to video game world design in that it's an artificial landscape, and it's designed to tell you a story and amuse and surprise and delight you. So I think video game designers should be interested in landscape gardens because they're doing the same sorts of things. Landscape gardens are the video games of the 18th and 19th century. So go and explore them. And I think also it's really, really worth looking at the great environmental storytelling studios. So Naughty Dog, I think, are one of the great studios for telling stories through their environments, filling them with little details, full of little gifts. Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, is really a present from the games designers to gamers. Everywhere you go in that world, there's something to find. There's a little gift for you. There's something that you find that you think was only put there for you. Your video game world should do that. Your world should be full of surprises and delights for the player that they wouldn't have thought they would find until they explore. I also became really fascinated by post-war urban planning when I was writing Boy Made of Blocks. And again, there's loads and loads and loads of really interesting lessons that game designers could learn from the 1960s, when you had really radical architects and town planners throughout Europe trying to find new ways to house these kind of incredibly exploding populations that we had in the 60s and 70s. And they developed really fascinating theories about space and structure and experience. The architects Peter and Alison Smithson, for example, designed a number of residential tower blocks around Britain. And they had this concept of streets in the sky. And they had this idea that they wanted to recreate a traditional city a traditional street, a neighborhood, but vertically. And they created their building, Robin Hood Gardens, this is in East London. They created it to facilitate social activity. So they have these really wide walkways so that lots of people could gather together, kids could ride bikes down them. And they also, if you notice here, the doors to the flats face towards each other, so that if people left their flats at the same time, they were almost forced to talk to each other. And what these designers were doing, what Peter and Alison Smithson were trying to do, was engineer social play, but in an urban space. And that's what game designers are doing. When you design a world, you're trying to engineer certain behaviors. You're trying to make people see the world and do certain things in certain ways. So I think there's lots to learn from 60s architecture and urban planning. I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to say, here's an aerial illustration of Robin Hood Gardens. And if you look at the way it's structured, it's two big buildings around a kind of a circular a garden. And you'll notice that's actually really, really similar to great online shooter design. So the best Call of Duty maps actually look like 60s British housing estates. I find that really interesting. So yeah, finally, make your world feel lived in. Make it feel as though humans have lived there, have been there, have left their mark on the world. Dishonored and Prey by Arcane are really great examples of this. Their worlds feel as though people have lived there and touched them. Finally, it's a really great idea to visit public buildings, stately homes, art galleries and museums, but not to look at the objects within them, but look at the way that they've been arranged, look at the way creators have designed the spaces to turn them into stories, to make them feel as though there's places that you want to explore. And if you can't be bothered to go to art galleries or museums, go shopping. IKEA is a narrative experience, and I'm not joking. If you go to IKEA, the retail psychology of IKEA is fascinating. It's a space designed to make you want to explore. It gives you examples of the worlds you might want to create in terms of like living rooms or bedrooms, and then it shows you gradually how to build them. It's a really, really fascinating space. IKEA is the Fallout 4 of shopping. So yeah, the most important thing is your world you create has to be unmistakably yours. It needs to be idiosyncratic and a little weird. You should fill it with personal details, and that's what makes it come alive. When the team at Arcane were designing Dishonored 2, they needed a new look for Corvo's mask, the lead character, and the art director, Sebastian Mitten, he brought in a ring that had been passed down through the women in his family, and it was a bit battered and worn and old, and they used this ring to influence Corvo's mask for Dishonored 2. So that's a really great example of personal design. The world that you build is the story that you tell. And in the end, every story you tell is about you. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith.